Hi, everyone. It's Mrs. Caruso, and it is week 5. And this week, we talked a lot about how God got the glory at Jamestown. We particularly focused in again on Captain John Smith, a particular character that we've been learning about, a man that God prepared, right? That means he got him ready for a special purpose, for good works that God had prepared in advance for Captain John Smith to do. So let's look at exactly how that unfolded in the first 3 years of our Jamestown colony. So we've said it before and we'll say it again. Of course, this picture is of Captain John Smith. God prepares individuals for his purpose. He gets them ready. And you guys, Captain John Smith is not the only individual in history that God prepared. In fact, God is preparing individuals right now, like you, for his purpose. He's getting you ready. Jeremiah 1:5 is one of your verses. You can say it with me. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. Jeremiah 1:5. And consecrated means set apart for a special purpose. When you are in Christ, when you belong to him, he is working those things out in your life for good, and they're for your good, but we know they're also for God's glory. That was something that Captain John Smith understood from a very young age. This, of course, is his picture, and we talked about the fact last week you looked at his picture pretty carefully, and we remembered that people didn't think he was terribly handsome, or he was very tall or dignified looking, but that he was virtuous. He had strong character on the inside, and we said he was brass without, but he was gold within. And that reminds us, of course, of the other verse that we've been working on, 1 Samuel 16:7. The Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. That's right. We need to remember that in our lives, that it's not about the outward appearance, that the Lord does not see like other people see, who see just the outside of us, the external. But the Lord sees the inside, the soul, right, as well as the body. So Captain John Smith, we know, was prepared by God to be a brave explorer and an important leader at Jamestown. We've talked a lot about what his life was like when he was a young man and growing up. And now God has placed him in this place for this time. And my goodness, he's gotten him ready, hasn't he? Let's remember, why did God make you and all things? I hope you're saying for his own glory. That's right. So all those experiences that Captain John Smith had as a young man and during the wars in Hungary and then preparing in England, all of those experiences, all of those big adventures that he had were getting him ready so that he could fulfill God's purpose and so that he could bring glory to God. Because why did God make John Smith and all things? For his own glory. You guys, it's not about us. So we need to be prepared. We need to do our best. But at the end of the day, we can't do any of those things unless God gives us the strength to do it and the breath in our lungs. He literally holds us up every day. And so we are to point back to him in all things. And that is what Captain John Smith did. And we want to trace that. And here I've said it here on the screen, Captain John Smith saw God's providence and he gave God glory. I hope you remember that right at the beginning of class, we made these, let me go back there. We made these crosses with just some little dowels, little tiny dowels, and pipe cleaners. So you guys made crosses, memorial crosses, and memorial has the word memory in it. That's, we're remembering something with these memorial crosses. And then we took them outside with us so that we could plant them at various times in Jamestown's story so that we could remember God's providence all along the way. when we got outside, I hope you'll remember that we first introduced the idea of what is a year. We talk about being 3 years old or 5 years old, or you guys are almost all 6 years old. And what does that mean? What is a year? So a year, we said, was the time it takes for our Earth to go all the way around the sun one time. So if we started here in the spring, it rotates this direction over to summer, and then back around the sun. It becomes fall. It continues on. Now it feels like winter here on our Earth. We're riding on Earth all the way around, right? And when we get back to spring, it has been 1 year. And it takes 365 days for Earth to make that whole trip all the way around the sun. So if you are 6 years old, then you have been around the sun 6 times. The next thing we talked about were the seasons. And the seasons are just divisions of the year that are special. We mark them out as special because it feels different to us outside. The temperature is either colder or hotter during different seasons of the year, and we get more hours of sun or less hours of sun depending on where we are. And this is kind of a science lesson for a different day. We would dig in a little more about the tilt of the Earth and why that affects our seasons. So the Earth is tilted over on its axis. And so that's why we have the seasons. Depends how close we are to the sun and where we are on that tilt as we move around the sun. So you guys knew your seasons already: spring, summer, fall, and winter. So we assigned everybody a season, and we stood around the sun, and Mrs. Crusoe, I carried the globe around through the seasons. I don't know if you'll remember, just so that we could remember that there are 4 seasons that we go through during the year as the Earth is traveling around the sun, that it goes through those 4 seasons. Summer has the longest days. If you notice, do you see how we're tilted towards the sun? So that's why it has the longest days. And then when we get over here to wintertime, do you see we're tilted away from the sun? So we have short days. We don't have as much sun shining on us in the wintertime because we're tilted away from the sun, at least in the northern hemisphere. That's the case. Again, that's a class for another day, isn't it? Then we assigned a symbol for each one of our seasons so that we could talk about the seasons in Jamestown and the first 3 years in Jamestown. So for spring, we gave the symbol of a pink flower. For summer, it was a bright yellow sun. For fall, our symbol is an orange leaf. And for wintertime, our symbol is a blue snowflake. So of course, we're going to start in the beginning. The Jamestown settlers arrived in the very last month of spring, which is May. So they arrived in May 1607. And you guys remember, we've told the story many times and you've acted it out in the driveway, that something really dramatic, something kind of scary happened just as they were arriving, right? That they couldn't find the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay, and they were almost ready to give up after all that time and all that difficulty and turn the ship around and head back to England so that they didn't run out of supplies. But Captain Smith kept a journal, and so we are using his words to see all the times in this Jamestown story that he pointed back to God, that he gave glory to God. So here's what he wrote. The sailors had passed the place on the map and they couldn't find the Chesapeake Bay. Some wanted to give up and go back to England before our supplies ran out. But God. Do you guys see that on your screen, those 2 words? But God. They're in big capital letters. That changes everything, doesn't it? In the midst of our stormy circumstances, hard things, even good things, but God. So Captain John Smith is remembering, and he sees God's providential hand moving. But God forced us to drift all night That means they had to take their sails down. Do you see there's no sails out on this ship? They're just drifting through the night. He forced us to drift all night because the storm was so strong and blew us by his providence right where we were trying to go. Guys, that wasn't lucky and it wasn't a coincidence. It was providence. How amazing. Who controls the wind? Who controls the storms? God does. And so, right there at the very beginning of this Jamestown settlement, right when they were arriving, we see that God got the glory. Once they arrived, built their fort, we went from spring into summer of 1607. And this was a very hard time. Do y'all remember how many men came with them to settle, to stay? We said over 100. They had 104, I believe. Well, 50 men died in those summer months. Only 54 were left by the time summer was over. So it was a very, very hard time in Jamestown in 1607. The Indians were attacking them from time to time. They were having a very hard time getting good fresh water to drink. They had mosquitoes and other bugs that were carrying diseases that were biting them. They were getting sick with disease and dying. And so about half of the men who came died during the summer of 1607. In the fall of 1607, things were so desperate that Captain John Smith volunteered to take 4 men with him and to go and try to find the chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, this big group of Indians, to find the chief to try to trade with some of the Indians who were close by. And we talked about what happened to him. He actually wrote down what happened to him in a book he called True Relation. And they added pictures to that book before it was published. And Captain John Smith looked at the pictures and said he approved them. Yep, this is what happened. He described it. They sketched it out and he said, yep, that's exactly it. So when we look at those engravings from way back in the 1600s, you can identify Captain Smith because of the CS. That stands for Captain Smith. So he describes that they traveled up and they got kind of back into this little tiny river area, very heavily wooded, some swamps nearby, and that they were attacked. He says he pulled out his gun and that he was able to shoot 3 of the attackers. So you see them there on the ground, 1, 2, 3, before they were able to rush in and capture him. And that's because all the other men, his men, were killed. He alone survived. So they rushed in and they captured him. And there were a couple things that really set him apart. They could tell, the Indians could tell he was the leader, and they thought he's probably worth capturing and bringing to our chief. Maybe we can get information from him. Maybe he can help us. And also, you guys, you have to understand, he had on his suit of armor. And they had not seen things like this before. It was a beautiful suit of armor, nicer than what anybody else had, because of his status and because he was a warrior. And this to them would have looked like kind of a space alien had landed, right? They were not used to seeing this. And then once they grabbed him, he reached in his pocket and he pulled out a compass. Let me make myself big again here. There we go. So he reached in and pulled out a compass and showed them how the arrow always pointed north. And again, this was a tool that to them must have seemed like magic. They'd never seen anything like that. And so they didn't know how to work this or what it did. And they thought, we should take him to our chief. He can explain this magical tool and perhaps give information about the other English who have arrived. So he was taken captive alone, and he was taken to the chief, whose name was Wahun Seneca. Oh, and here, if I move myself out of the way, it says he was captured by the king of Pamunkey. And the king of Pamunkey was the chief's brother. So one of these men capturing him is supposed to be the king of the Pamunkey tribe. I know it's kind of fun to say, isn't it? And his name, that man's name was Opie Kancanoe. So Opie Kancanoe, we'll make it this guy. Opie Kancanoe was the chief of the Pamunkey tribe, And he's going to take Captain John Smith to his brother, who is chief over all the tribes. That man's name was Wahun Seneca. There's another engraving where Captain Smith describes his trip over to where the chief Wahun Seneca was, and he says they rejoiced around him. They were so happy they'd captured him, and so here they are dancing around him. You see that CS for Captain Smith, and then they tied him to a tree for some period of time. So they show you here in the same picture that later they tied him to the tree. This is our map. You all have looked at this, I know, very carefully and very closely. And so you'll remember that Jamestown is right here where my little cursor is moving. And honestly, interestingly, they did not have that far to go because the capital city where the chief lived was a place called Werowocomoco. You do not have to remember all these Indian names, but Werowocomoco was very close. We looked at it on the map. Remember that it's just a few miles from Jamestown. So right here is Werowocomoco. He had never seen it before. They'd never ventured out that far, but that's where they took him. And that's where Chief Wahun Seneca met Captain Smith for the first time. Now, many people call him Powhatan, but Powhatan was actually the name of his whole nation. He was chief of the Powhatan nation. And inside the Powhatan nation, you guys, were lots of little tribes like this one, the Matoamecs. There were the Potomacs. There were the Pamunkeys. There were the Monacans. There were the, I may not say that one right, Kuskarawaks and the Takawogs. So anyway, many different tribes. And he held them together not because they liked him. They were not all on the same team because he was such a nice guy. He had conquered them with his warriors, and he was forcing them to be part of his nation. And if they disobeyed him, he would come with his warriors and capture their women, bring them back to Werowocomoco, and they would have to ransom them. They would have to pay him money to get their women and their children back. Does that sound like a king we've studied before? Sounds like King John, doesn't it? Yes, that's because evil, wicked kings tend to do the same kinds of things no matter where we find them, right? That sinful heart does sinful things no matter where we are on the globe. So that's how he maintained control. That's how he controlled all these other groups of Indian tribes. And there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people that were all under him. So he was like a king, but they called him chief of the Powhatans. His name, again, was Wahun Seneca. This is what his village would have looked like. And one of the large homes like this would have been his. They also would have had a very big, long house where they could have meetings, where the men would come to talk things over and make decisions. So this is what their village would have looked like. Notice too, they have palisades, don't they? So they've protected their village much the same way that the English have protected their settlement, with a palisaded wall. One of you pointed out, I think I could get in there, and you probably could get in there, but it would be hard. So they recognized that it still would be hard for lots and lots of people to come through a wall like that. And honestly, you guys, we're not absolutely certain that they were spaced that far apart. That's just what our artist drew for us. The buildings that you see, these are called Yehakens. Now that's a word that would be good to know. Yehaken. And they built their homes a little differently than the English did. They wove together the reeds that they found in the river to make these big mats, almost like a carpet that you would lay down. So they wove it together, and then they would take those long mats and lay them over a wooden frame. And when you put mat after mat, when you layer them up, then the rain can't get through anymore. So they were very tightly woven, and then they were laid one on top of the other to create shelter for these Powhatan tribes. So they all lived in very similar Yehakens. Now this is the moment that Captain John Smith was delivered to. This is what it looked like. This is what Captain Smith described when they brought him to Chief Wahun Seneca. So here you see him. And we have a fire going on. They've got a fire that's lit and smoke coming out. So you can imagine how smoky it would have been inside this longhouse Yehaken. Also notice that little platform he's sitting up on. It's interesting, you guys. The only reason we really know because of course, over time, all these different tribes started to live like Americans. So today they go to Walmart and they eat Chick-fil-A and they live in houses like we do. And we don't have any of these anymore. And they didn't make drawings. So the only reason we really know what these buildings looked like is because the English made drawings of them. So when we go to Jamestown, you're going to get to go inside some recreated Yehakens. They've built new ones so that you can see what it was like. But the only reason we know is because Captain John Smith and others told us what they looked like. Now, the chief, you see that picture right up here in the corner of Captain John Smith's map. But Chief Wahun Seneca had an idea. He thought it was a great idea to show off Captain John Smith and to take him around to all of the different tribes so that they could see that he was not afraid of the English. In fact, he had conquered the English. He had the English captain as his prisoner. And so that's exactly what he did. For weeks and weeks, he had Captain John Smith carried from tribe to tribe to tribe all around the Chesapeake, showing off his prize. But Captain John Smith saw God's providence in that because remember we said he's always paying attention, just like that ostrich on the top of his coat of arms. So he was very watchful. He was taking notes in his head the whole time about how the tribes related to one another and where they were located and how well armed they were and how many warriors they had. So he was thinking very strategically like a warrior, right? The whole time that they were bringing him around. He was gathering information that he would need later. You guys, this too wasn't an accident. It wasn't coincidence. It was part of God's providence for Captain John Smith. Well, at the end of that big tour, they brought him back to Werowocomoco, and there was this big feast that was held, and Captain John Smith wrote about it, and he said he was a little bit nervous. He wasn't sure what was going to happen. He thought maybe they had been fattening him up this whole time, and then this was the big final fattening up before they killed him, like a sacrifice in the Old Testament. That's what he thought might be happening. So he was not feeling good about this. Here he is, you see, sitting on the ground. His hands are bound, and he sees some kind of strange religious ceremony that's not about the one true God happening. And so he was very fearful for what might unfold. And then he told us in his journals that what happened next was that they laid his head on a big rock and that the chief, Wahun Seneca, gave the order to have him killed. So here we see Wahun Seneca, and here you see his brother, the king of the Pamunkeys, right? That man's name was Opequan Canute, right? Like you're canoeing. Opequan Canute. Here you see them, and you see these warriors about to bash his brains out. That's what he wrote. When Pocahontas, the king's own dear daughter, came and laid her head on his to rescue him. Let's hear what he says. He wrote, "The chief's dearest daughter took my head in her arms and laid her head on mine to save me from death. Even after that, I thought they might kill me at any moment. But Almighty God, by his providence, changed the hearts of the fierce Indians." Captain Smith writes this because he wants you to see that God gets the glory. God changed the hearts. God prompted Pocahontas to come into this big meeting of all these men and plead for the life of Captain John Smith. God got the glory. So you guys, he was captured in the fall of 1607, but he was kept all the way into the winter of 1607. So this event happened right around Christmas time of 1607. The colonists had only been here for a few months. They don't let him go until January, early January of 1608. So one of the things we learned was that the winter months are December January, and February. Move me out of the way. So a winter we always change years during the winter time. So we moved from 1607, the year that they came, into 1608 in the winter time. So they bring him back in 1608, and when Captain John Smith returned to the fort in January of 1608, he found that things were terrible, that it had gone from bad, where they had lost 50 men, and they only had 54 left, and now, during his time away, there were only 38 left. So more men had died while he was gone. However, because of his experience, he actually now had a friendship with Wahun Seneca. Wahun Seneca was interested in the English. He thought he had a person that kind of owed him something in Captain John Smith, and he wanted to trade with them. He was interested to see what kind of things they had that he might be able to use. Particularly, he wanted to use those things to keep all the other tribes controlled. So maybe the English had weapons that were better than what he had, and he could trade for them. Maybe they had gunpowder. He knew they had gunpowder, and he wanted some. Here's a funny little story, you guys. He made Captain John Smith leave his gunpowder with him. He said, you can go back to your fort, but I'm going to keep that gunpowder. But he didn't understand how it worked. And so black powder looks like little tiny black seeds. So he pulled that pouch out and he planted it. They said, and then later they talked about it, and he said, we couldn't get it to grow. So he thought that gunpowder, these were seeds, and that you planted it and it would grow more gunpowder. And he knew it made things go boom, but he didn't quite understand how it worked yet. So that's a funny little story about trying to plant gunpowder seeds, and it didn't work out too well for Wahun Seneca. But he is now willing to trade with the Jamestown settlers. And so when Captain Smith returned in January of 1608, things were terrible, but they started to turn around. But Captain Smith, again, doesn't take credit for himself or that he had done this great thing by being courageous and that he had developed a relationship with the chief. Instead, what he wrote was, now all our food was gone, and there were no more fish in the river, and we thought the Indians would attack any minute. When God, you see those big words again? When God, in that terrible time, changed the hearts of the Indians, and they brought so much food that no one was hungry anymore. Specifically, Pocahontas came with other braves. That's the name for an Indian warrior. She came with her braves, bringing food to the colony regularly throughout the wintertime. And you guys, one of the reasons it's so hard in the wintertime is it's cold outside, and the animals are not out running around. The animals are hibernating, or they're staying in their dens where it's warm, so it's harder to hunt them. The fish they dive down deep in the river to the lowest parts because that's the warmest part. So it's hard to catch fish. It's hard to hunt. You have to store up food for the winter, and they had not done that. They didn't have enough, and they would have starved to death if not, right? But God changed the hearts of the Indians. So that's the winter of 1607 into 1608. So remember, spring 1608, summer we've survived. That's when things were so terrible, and they got down to 54 people. In the fall, Captain John Smith was captured. He's with them, the Powhatan Confederacy, all through the fall and into the winter. They release him. Things are now really terrible in Jamestown, down to 38 people. But God, right? When God now changed the hearts of the Indians so that they brought food to them and they could survive until spring of 1608. Now, things are getting pretty good. In fact, we said things are great in 1608, that things turned. It was really tough in 1607 when they got there. But things turned for the better, and things were great in 1608. Can you say that? Captain Smith wrote that when the Indians would come and they would trade and they would spend time talking to one another, in fact, Pocahontas was beginning to teach him Algonquin words. He was teaching her English. I'm sure she wasn't the only one. So they all began to try to communicate with one another. And one of the things that Captain Smith wrote that he was able to communicate He said, the Indians knew that I adored God, who created all things, and they called him the God of Captain Smith. So they began to hear about this different God that wasn't this, he had talked about this idol, this crazy thing that they worshiped when he was with them. And he began to tell them that, no, 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 there is only one true God, and I worship him. And they began to know that there was something different that he believed, and they called that God that created all things the God of Captain Smith. You guys, God got the glory there in the Jamestown colony in the spring of 1608. By summer of 1608, how were things going? Things were great in 1608. So things were great enough and stable enough that Captain John Smith believed that it was time for him to go and do one of the jobs that the Virginia Company had sent him to do. And that was he was supposed to do his big exploration of the Chesapeake and create the map. So that happened in 1608, you guys. He took 2 big 7-week trips. He had 14 men, so that does not leave very many men at all back at the fort. But at this time, relationship was good with the local people, and they felt that they could do that safely, and it was safe. The Indians did not attack while they were gone, but they loaded up on this shallop, this 14-foot, he called it a discovery barge. So they all loaded up on this 14-foot boat. It was all open. There were no cabins to go sleep in, so you just had to sleep on the deck or camp outside all along the way. What an adventure, right? And off they went. And they traveled all through the Chesapeake, all up the rivers. You guys looked at the map and saw that wherever they traveled, when they got to their very farthest point, that they would hammer into a tree what? They got all the way out here. We looked at that map again, the big one that I had with me, and we found those Maltese crosses. Yes, that's what they hammered in, right? A Maltese cross, a brass cross was hammered into the tree at the furthest point that they had reached. So you guys, that means somewhere out there in those woods and along those riverbanks, and there are 27 Maltese crosses out there. But they were little tiny things, and it's kind of like trying to find a needle in a haystack. There are actually people who have tried. You can look that up online to locate them. And so far, we have one person that thinks they have, but it's debated. We aren't sure that that was really one of Captain John Smith's crosses that they found. But they're out there because he told us. He put them right there in the tree, right? So on the first trip, as they traveled back, let me use my map, yep, zoomed in. So they were coming back, you guys, through the Chesapeake Bay. They've got to come all the way back here. Do you see this river down here? It starts with a P. It says Powhatan Flu. Flu is part of a Latin word for river. So they had this right here, they called it the Powhatan River. And then as you move up, it's the James River. And of course, Jamestown sits right there. Well, this is where they needed to go. They needed to come back to the Powhatan River. And as they were journeying back, they came out of the Potomac. Now let me zoom in. So they had come out of the Potomac River, and they were coming right along this peninsula here. And just as they got to this spot right there, there was a little island, and Captain John Smith steered a little too close. The Discovery barge got a little too close to that island, and the tide was out, so that it was shallow, more shallow than they realized, and they got stuck right there on the sandbar. And they could not rock themselves off. They got out, they pushed, they were having a really hard time. They decided, we'll just sit until the tide rises a little bit, and then it'll be easy for us to move on. Well, while they were sitting there, they noticed this huge school of fish came. And it was just like boiling all around them. Well, you guys, any food that they're going to eat while they're out there, they have to find it, hunt it, fish it, catch it, right? And so if you have an opportunity to get food, you get food. And here were all these fish. In fact, there were so many that Captain John Smith wrote that the men did not have to use fishing line or anything. They just took their swords out and started spearing those fish. So he was doing it too, of course. So he was spearing the fish with his sword. And he got this weird fish and lifted it up, and it was big and floppy and wiggly and weird shaped. It was a stingray. Well, when he went to get it off, when he went to take it off of his sword, that stingray boop, whipped around and it stung him. The barb hit him right in the wrist. And he said in his journal, instantly he felt so much pain. I don't know, maybe you know someone who's been stung by a stingray and they can tell you. I do know somebody who was and had about the same experience that Captain John Smith did, except they were able to call 911 and get an ambulance for him. There was no ambulance here. So Captain Smith said that his whole hand got swollen, and then he saw the poison working up his arm, and his whole arm just blew up big like a balloon and then up into his shoulder, and he knew that the poison was going towards his heart. He felt so sick, so weak, that he thought for sure he was going to die. So he actually told his men to dig a grave for him, and they did. And then he tells us what happened next. I expected to die, he said, but God had caused Dr. Russell to pack a special medicine, and he put it on the wound. By night, the pain was gone, and we cooked up that stingray and ate him for dinner. Y'all, I think that is a great picture of Captain John Smith. When he faces death, he's courageous and brave, but he recognizes that it was a miracle. It was not coincidence. It was not lucky that they, number one, brought Dr. Russell with them, that he was still alive. He was one of the ones who had survived all this time, that he came on the trip with them, and that he had packed the exact medicine that was going to be needed. He sees God's hand in that, but God had caused all this. And then I think it's just kind of funny that by nighttime, they're taking their revenge on that stingray. The stingray that thought he was going to get Captain John Smith now gets gotten or eaten by Captain John Smith himself. So he had that stingray for dinner, by golly. Now later, Captain John Smith wrote this about things that are hard, because this was their whole journey was so difficult. But he said, if Jesus's disciples had not traveled far from home and suffered hard things and even death to tell people the truth about Jesus, then we Englishmen would still be miserable and lost, just like, he called them salvages, just like the salvages that we see here today. He said we would be in that same boat if somebody a long time ago, Jesus' disciples, had not been willing to suffer and travel far from their homes and face death. And so he said, he ended it with, everything of worth is hard. Worth means it's worth something, that it's valuable, it's precious. Everything that's precious is hard. Guys, is knowing about Jesus and living with him eternally precious? It's the most precious thing of all. It's worth doing hard things for. It's worth risking for. And how grateful we are that Captain John Smith and the Englishmen were willing to risk things and suffer hard things in order to bring the truth of God's word and plant it in the New World and share it with these Powhatan Indians. So he gets back after these two big journeys, 7 weeks each time. They covered 2,500 miles in that Discovery barge, y'all. So incredible journeys. And he's got all his drawings ready to do these maps. And now he gets back to the fort in 1608. And this small group of men elected him their president. So he's now in charge. Well, Captain John Smith says, I'm going to do it God's way. The only way we're going to survive is if we do things the way that the Bible tells us to. And in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, he opened God's word and he said, if you don't work, you don't eat. So we're not going to survive unless everybody pitches in and does their part. There's no room for laziness here. We have to have strong character. So he ruled over them, he governed them. And guys, sadly, that was because they didn't have good self-government, internal self-government. When we don't have good internal self-government in here, then we need a lot of government on the outside of us, like our moms and dads. Or in this case, they needed a strong president to say, if you don't work, you're not going to eat, because they probably wouldn't have worked otherwise. But we see him using Bible law in the things that he commands as president. And so again, we see God getting the glory because God's laws are the ones that are being used for the survival of Jamestown. Also, in the fall of 1608, he's newly elected as the president, and just in time because 120 new colonists arrived, including 2 women. Their names were Mistress Forrest and Mistress Burris. So Mistress Forrest and Mistress Burris was her servant, and Mistress Forrest was married to Mr. Forrest. Okay, so anyway, she arrived with her servant. Mistress Forrest actually died not too long after she got here. She got sick, but her servant, whose name was Anne Burris, lived a very long life there in Jamestown, got married, had children, all that. But 120 new colonists have arrived. But how are things in 1608? Thankfully, things are great in 1608, and we still have plenty of corn and plenty of vegetables, and we were working hard because Captain John Smith said if we don't, we're not going to eat. And so everything was fine, even though 120 new mouths had just arrived that would have to be fed. So that's all in the fall of 1608. Now, this is when we paused and we said, this was such a great time because there was good trade between the Englishmen and the Powhatan Confederacy. And what we wanted most from them was food, primarily corn. They could grow corn better than we could, and you can make so many things out of corn. You can make good corn bread and corn cakes and popcorn, I guess, if you wanted to, but lots of products could be made from corn that would help us survive. And so we were trading for corn. And the Englishmen would actually bring things from England that they thought the Indians would want. So one of the things we know they traded, because they wrote about it, were blue beads, that they loved these English blue beads. They also brought brass bells and copper cups, copper pots, copper bowls. They loved these metal things because they did not have much metal work in these tribes. They also loved hatchets, which you see here on the ground. So the hatchets, again, because it was a more finely formed metal blade than what the Indians had. And then we played our little game, right, where you could trade a blue bead for 1 scoop of corn, or you could trade your brass bell for 2 scoops of corn, or a copper cup for 5 scoops of corn, right? And we did our little cards where you got to practice your math and bring to me some trade goods, and you took home to your tribe scoops of corn, right? Lots of scoops of corn. You guys cleaned me out with all your copper cups and blue beads and brass bells. So that's all happening, right, during fall of 1608 into the winter of 1608 into 1609, because we know we change into a new year during the wintertime. That winter, everything was fine. Everything was fine. It was great in 1608, and it was still fine in 1609. I'm hoping that helps you remember. In fact, Captain Smith wrote, "By our own efforts, we got a good store of corn." That's not what he wrote. Y'all see the word? What's that big word? By God's assistance, we had gotten a good store of corn. Here again, Captain Smith gives God the glory. And I haven't been saying it, but every time that we saw Captain Smith give God the glory, we took one of our memorial crosses and we went and we planted it right by that season in the driveway, okay, on our little timeline, remembering all the many times that Captain John Smith pointed back to God and gave him the glory. All right, so it's spring now of 1609. And in 1609, things were still fine. They were still fine. Summer of 1609, things were still fine. The colony was growing, expanding, safety was widespread. I do have to point out, I had a hard time finding good pictures to put in my presentation. So the people look correct, but guys, they weren't really building these kind of houses yet. They still were building those wattle and daub houses that we talked about last week. In fact, in the summer of 1609, things were so fine that the investors back in England decided they were going to send a whole new group of settlers. In fact, 500 were coming now. We wanted to grow the colony. So a third group of ships leaves England. We've only had the first group that came, and now this second group that came when Captain John Smith was president with 120 people and 2 ladies, right? And now this is called the third supply. They're going to leave England in the summer of 1609. And they're carrying some pretty important passengers, like a lieutenant governor. Lieutenant means he's going to be a helper governor. So they're sending a helper for Captain John Smith, and then eventually they're going to send another guy right behind him. He's just not quite ready yet. And his name, the guy coming, is going to take over and give Captain John Smith a break. And that guy is not quite ready yet. So we're sending the helper guy, and his name is Lieutenant Governor Thomas Gates. We've got a new pastor for the colony, Reverend Richard Buck. What happened to our first pastor? Yes, he died. So we need a new pastor. Captain Newport, who was one of our captains the first time, he's coming back with this group of ships. The captain of the biggest ship, this one right here, this is called the Sea Venture. And the important people are actually all on that boat. Probably not a good idea. Take a note. Don't put everybody on the same boat. But anyway, they were all the important people were on this big boat, and including a man named John Rolfe, who was kind of a businessman and a farmer. And he had a wife, and his wife actually has a baby while they're, I think actually she has the baby in just a few minutes. Not quite yet in the story. All right, so these important people were on board the Sea Venture. There were 9 ships that left England in summer of 1609, because in the summer of 1609, y'all, things were just fine. Well, all these ships, these 9 ships, stayed all together all the way across the Atlantic. They traveled from England. They came up through the islands, up the coast. We're coming to the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay. That's where my yellow arrow is pointing, right? When just as they got to Cape Henry, almost like the very first group of settlers, a horrible storm came up. In fact, it was a hurricane. And this hurricane blew all of the fleet apart. So they lost sight of one another. Several days later, 6 of the ships were able to find one another, and eventually a 7th ship found the other 6. And those 7 ships would all sail into the Chesapeake, and they kind of straggled into Jamestown, but they were all, their sails were ripped up, their supplies had been dumped over, they were in terrible shape, but about 300 of them arrived in Jamestown. This is summer of 1609. But how were things? In 1609, things were just fine. And so that was providential, because they arrived at a time that wasn't a difficult time in Jamestown. We had a strong leader, we had good trade, plenty of food, and so even though they were bedraggled and didn't have much with them, Captain John Smith was able to take in these 300 people and take care of them and get them going and find housing and put them to work. And so now he was president over our colony when it was at its biggest, the biggest that it had ever been. Almost 500 people now were living there in Jamestown. But in the fall of 1609, just a few months later, kind of just after things had gotten settled and things were good and we were trading and building, and then in the fall of 1609, there was an accident, and Captain John Smith's gunpowder bag, that's what I have on there on the screen, it's worn kind of hanging down around your waist, like down near your leg. And someone else fired their gun, and a spark flew from their gun, hit that bag, and burned through it. And when it hit the gunpowder that was inside, it exploded. It was like a huge firework went off right next to his leg. And so it burned all through his clothing. It burned his leg really badly. He had a terrible injury. And this time, as they looked at him, even the doctors said, we can't help you. You've got to get on a ship and try to get back to England in time for them to help you there, even though it's going to take probably 7 or 8 weeks. So immediately they put him on a ship and sent him back to England to get help. Well, Captain John Smith will survive and he will heal up, but he doesn't ever make it back to Jamestown. They only send ships every so often. And he would have wanted to come back, but he got sent out on other missions at different times. And as life turned out, he never made it back to Jamestown. Well, you guys, as soon as he was removed from Jamestown, that strong leader was gone. It's kind of like when mom leaves, if she left you all on your own, would you go rustle around in the fridge and eat foods that you're not supposed to? Even though she said, we're not going to eat all those popsicles, but might you eat all the popsicles while she was gone? Well, that's kind of what happened. They did not have good internal self-government. So when their external government was removed, when Captain John Smith left, they did not govern themselves well. On top of that, that year we know was a really dry year. There was not a lot of rain. So even the food that they had planted, the seeds they had planted, did not grow well. But guess what? That was the same situation for all of the Powhatan tribes. The corn that they had planted didn't grow well. So they did not have as much extra that they could trade with the Jamestown colonists. So some of the Jamestown colonists acted really ugly towards the Indians and treated them badly. Wahun Seneca, the chief, saw Captain John Smith is gone, and these people are acting pretty terribly. And he saw it as an opportunity to kick them out. He decided he wanted the English gone. So he attacked their fort, and then he sent his warriors to surround the fort so that no one could come or go. They couldn't get out to try to hunt even if they wanted to try to gather firewood. You were taking your life in your hands just to go outside and try to chop down trees to burn to keep warm. So this was the worst time ever in the colony. We went from things were great in 1608, things were just fine in 1609, but by the end, you guys, by December of 1609 and now into 1610, the winter right here, it was terrible. They called this the starving time. And we went from 500 settlers when Captain John Smith left. By the spring of 1610, right? We're now in a new year. By the spring of 1610, there were only 60 people left. From 500, only 60 people were left alive. What would happen to them? Well, we left another part of our story undone as well, and that's what happened to those other ships that came with the big fleet back in 1609 in the summer, right? What happened to the biggest ship, the Sea Venture, with all the important people on it? Well, we know 7 of the 9 ships made it to Jamestown. One of them was lost at sea. But the big ship, the Sea Venture, experienced that hurricane. It got caught up in the hurricane and actually blew with the hurricane. And finally, much like the first settlers, they had to take all their sails down and just drift. And God blew them by his providence right to a tiny island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It's the only one in that whole wide blue sea called Bermuda. Now, the people on board the Sea Venture had heard about Bermuda, and they were so grateful for land, right? They'd probably take anything at this point, but they'd heard terrible things about Bermuda. They had heard that there were devils that were there. There were monsters. And they thought that because any sailor who had been close to that island heard these horrible screaming sounds. It was horrible. Like, it just went on and on and on and on. Well, when they got there, they found out what that was. This is the only little piece of land, you guys, in the whole wide Atlantic Ocean. So birds, seabirds, when they're flying, if they get out that far, that's the only place for them to stop and rest. So it's full of seabirds all the time, and they're all making their noises, and probably making their messes too. But anyway, they're all making these noises, and that's what the sound was in Bermuda. Well, there were several providential things that happened when their ship came to rest in Bermuda. So the first providential thing was that, number one, they found Bermuda. Only God could have blown them directly to that little island. But the second thing was that when they approached me, they couldn't really steer too well. They could try, but their ship was badly damaged. So they scraped up onto a reef and the ship didn't sink. In fact, it stayed above water and it wrecked close enough to the island that they could come out and collect all the pieces of the boat and use it to build 2 new boats that they would use later to escape, to continue on to Jamestown. So the fact that they still had all the pieces and parts of their boat and no one died. 150 people safely arrived on this island and were able to disembark, get off the boat with all their supplies and all the things they brought. So an incredible miracle of God. And they knew that it was. And the pastor that came with them, right? This was Reverend Buck, Richard Buck. Richard Buck said, we have to write all this down. And they did. They wrote it down. And later they would send letters when they were able to send letters back to England. They sent letters and explained all about what had happened. And there was a playwright, a man who wrote plays back in England that was alive at that time. And he heard about this incredible story and he wrote a play about it. And the man writing the play, his name was William Shakespeare. You might have heard of him or you will. And his play was called The Tempest, which means the storm. So he wrote a whole play about what had happened to these colonists on their way to Jamestown. Now, I read you a story when we were together called The Perfect Storm that talked all about what had happened on their way, right? And introduced you to some of those characters. And then we said the reason they called it The Perfect Storm, the reason that this author has given it that name, The Perfect Storm, is because for all, anybody looking at the situation would think that they would have been destroyed. Their ship should have been sunk and destroyed, and all those people would have been lost. But God, in his providence, saved them. And in fact, they included in their story the inscription that they wrote, right, just before they left the island, that they planted a cross and that they left this inscription. They said this was in memory of our great deliverance, both from a mighty storm and a leak in our ship. We have set up this cross to the honor of God. So you guys, they too recognized that this was the providence of God. God got the glory. As I mentioned to you, eventually they would build the 2 ships out of the wreckage from the Sea Venture. So they were able to build a ship they called the Patience and a ship they called the Deliverance. Those names are important. Patience is what they were learning, and deliverance is what God had given them. Deliverance means saving somebody. If I deliver somebody from something, I save them from it, and God had saved them. So they named their ships the Patience and the Deliverance. And in the spring of 1610, they were ready with their 2 new ships to continue on to Jamestown. And this time, guys, it's only going to take them 2 weeks to get there. They were very close, but they were stranded on this island until they could build new ships. So pretty resourceful, right? These 150 people pitched in together. They build the ships, and now in the spring of 1610, they take off towards Jamestown. But do you remember what we called the winter of 1609 into 1610 back at Jamestown? How were things going? It was the starving time. And of 500 people who had gone, we only had 60 left. So in spring 1610, when the Patience and the Deliverance finally got to Jamestown, they couldn't believe what they saw. What they saw were 60 starving people. They said they looked like skeletons. They were so skinny. They had, of course, with them the new lieutenant governor, the helper governor, whose name was Thomas Gates. And so he tried to stay. They tried to, rebuild and help the people. And after about 2 weeks, he decided this was too much and we weren't going to be able to survive. But the people were so weak that they probably should have destroyed their fort. In fact, we know they should have. You don't want to leave a fort for the Indians to move into, and now they can use it against you. So they should have burned their whole fort down and packed up everything, all the weaponry, all the cannon, but they were so weak and tired that they just buried their cannons in the ground and left the fort with the gates open. They loaded everybody up on the ships and said, we're just going to have to go back to England and give up on this whole project. And off they went in their 2 ships. They sailed down the James River, right, 53 miles. They got to the Chesapeake Bay, and y'all, they were just at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, but the tide was running against them. It was very hard for them to steer their ships. And so they decided to stop and put the anchor down and wait for the tides to turn, and then they would continue on their journey. Well, in that 12 hours that they were waiting for the tides to turn, somebody spotted sails coming towards them. Oh no, were these friends? Were they enemies? Whose ships were they? And as those ships got closer, they realized that they were English ships that were coming to help them. And it was that new governor. His name was Lord Delaware. So Lord Delaware was coming with more settlers and a year's worth of supplies, and he got there just in time. They wrote that if he had waited 2 tides longer, if he had waited in England 2 tides longer, y'all, just one day, that by the time he got there, he would have found no one in Jamestown, and probably would have, if there was no one to govern, he probably would have turned around himself and come back. So again, we see God's providential timing, that it wasn't luck or coincidence that these starving settlers that were giving up on Jamestown just happened to meet up with their new governor as he was coming into the James River. Here they are, seeing, here are the settlers seeing Lord Delaware's ship is arriving with all the other people and supplies, and they're going to turn around. And this is, of course, they left in May of 1610, so the spring of 1610. Now it's summer of 1610. When they came back, they turned around, came back to Jamestown, and we know they wrote down what they did. And the first thing that he did was he ordered a church service to be held, that they all came back into the fort, and they worshiped God and asked God to preserve the colony and to rebuild them. Then they got to work. One of the things that had fallen into terrible disrepair was the church. So they rebuilt their church immediately. And that's the church I've shown you pictures of before. I don't think I put it in this slideshow, but they found the outline of that church today. So we can stand inside the very place where Lord Delaware prayed that God would preserve the colony. Well, back in England, Captain John Smith heard about this too, and he wrote about this. Even though he wasn't there, he heard about it and he wrote about it. He wrote this: "It wasn't luck that made Lord Delaware get there just in time. Things were terrible." Do you see those 2 words? But God would not let the colony be abandoned. Once again, Captain John Smith pointed us towards God. God got the glory for saving the Jamestown settlement and the English colonization in the New World. So you guys, that is the story of the first 3 years at Jamestown, right? Starting in spring of 1607, when things were really hard when they got there and so many men died. Captain John Smith was captured. Then he was released in the winter of 1608. So the first few months of 1608, he comes back. Now we start to have good relationships with the Powhatan people, and they're trading, and so things were great in 1608. That's when he took his big trip. I was almost killed by the stingray, but God preserved his life and God got the glory. He becomes president of the colony in 1608. More settlers arrived in 1608. They continued to do well into 1609. They were trading. We practiced all that trading with the Indians. And then in the summer of 1609, we got the survivors, right? We had a new group that was coming, and they got hit in the hurricane, and 300 of them come to Jamestown, and Captain John Smith says, "Come on in, things are just fine," in 1609, right? But then the accident takes him out of the scene. So at the end of 1609, Captain John Smith has to go back to London so that in 1610, that winter of 1609-1610, we call it the starving time, right? And we went from 500 people down to 60. But God had providentially preserved one of those ships in the hurricane, the great big ship, the Sea Venture. He had saved them miraculously so that they could rebuild and actually send 2 rescue ships to Jamestown. And those ships were called the Deliverance and the Patience, right? So the Patience and the Deliverance come, but they decide too that they're going to give up in 1610. And they turned and loaded everybody up and went down the James River, where Lord Delaware intercepted them, turned them around. He was there just in the nick of time. Not an accident, not coincidence, God's providence. They came back to Jamestown, and you guys, it was also providential that they had been so weak that they hadn't burned down their fort. There was a fort to come home to. Imagine if that's what Lord Delaware again had come to, that they might have given up on it. They just dug up their cannon and began to repair their fort. So in 1610, we begin again. That's kind of the story of those 3 years in Jamestown. In 1610, we begin again. God preserved his colony, and in all things, Captain John Smith gave God the glory. That's really the focus of our lesson this week. Next week, we're going to focus on how God prepared and used another individual to bless the English, but how the English also blessed that individual. Of course, next week is Princess Pocahontas. All right, you guys have a great week, and I will see you soon.